Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yeah, welcome to the course. The title of this course is The Contemporary Issues in Philosophy of Mind and Cognition. I am Ranjan Kumar Panda from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. This course is also shared with Professor Rajkishore Nath. We teach philosophy in Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Bombay. Today, we will be discussing about how we shall study this course. As you all know, that philosophy of mind is one of the important subject in philosophy. It is important because it deals with the concept of consciousness, and consciousness is central to human life as a whole, and consciousness is studied by different disciplines. For example, people from the background of neuroscience, cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence are talking about consciousness extensively, but their study of consciousness is purely a scientific study, and our approach will be philosophical rather than purely a scientific one. It is philosophical in the sense that philosophical inquiry goes back to the history in which this question is raised: what is consciousness and how it is related to a human life. As Wittgenstein, one of the famous analytic thinker of 20th century, pointed out that consciousness is life itself. We want to look at how this question is related to life and how this question is delved since the time memorial. I say it time memorial because this question has been debated and discussed in Upanishads. This question has been debated and discussed in Greek tradition. Now, it is from that point of view, rather we will be talking about consciousness and its ascientific position in the history of humanity. Consciousness, as we all know, that is not a phenomenon which is existing out there, rather it is a phenomenon that has to be experienced, that has to be felt, that has to be realized, etc., etc. Now, then if it is a phenomenon which is to be realized, and then the question is, how do we talk about it? Because the very talk of this subject becomes a problematic one, because it is not available there, meaning thereby it is not available in the world. But many naturalistic thinkers in the contemporary time have discussed that consciousness is a part of the world, consciousness is related to the world. Now, again and again I will be talking about consciousness, particularly because consciousness is same as mind. We do not discuss that consciousness is something different from mind, but if you look at Upanishads, how this then particularly in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, this story of two birds are very important, where consciousness is treated as a phenomenon which is witnessing the mind, it is witnessing the person, where mind and persons are achieve, they are one, and consciousness is something which is different, which is independent of the mind, which is independent of the person. Now, so there is a distinction between mind and consciousness. In the Greek tradition, you will also find that consciousness has been associated with, it is identified with the concept of soul. But in 21st century, when we talk about consciousness, we do not really talk about the concept of soul, because people feel that such a discussion take us into the realm of religious studies. Philosophy as a discipline is not a religious study, is not associated with religion. It is, philosophy is in fact is one of the foundational disciplines. Its questions are very basic to the life, because I have mentioned earlier that consciousness is life itself. So, what kind of questions philosophy puts forth to all of us? So, for example, what is justice? Plato is discussing this in Republic. What is good? In a similar way, people are also discussing what is consciousness. So, is consciousness real? Is justice real? We all know that justice has to do something with our real life. Similarly, consciousness has to do something with our real life, precisely because we all are conscious human beings, and there are also conscious beings in the world. Now, how we are different from other beings? What is our identity as a human being and as one of the distinct, unique being in the reality? So, that is the topic which we will be discussing in this course. Now, consciousness is central to our studies. What are the issues that we will be mainly concerned with? The issues here are the problem of dualism, the problem of reductionism, the problem of free will, the problem of personal identity, etc. Now, dualism is a philosophical problem, precisely because in the history of philosophy, people have been discussing about what is the reality, what is the reality as a whole and as such. Now, philosophers have again and again replied to this metaphysical questions, that what is the reality. Philosophical enquiry is precisely a metaphysical enquiry, and metaphysics provides a foundation to philosophical enquiries. Now, what is reality? Is the reality constituted of matter and some other material elements, or is that reality is constituted of something which is non-material, non-physical, etc., etc. So, when we talk about non-material, non-physical, we do refer to this notion of consciousness, that consciousness is not a physical phenomenon, rather it is a non-physical phenomenon. Now, this debate is very prominent in the philosophy of René Descartes. So, we will be discussing about this problem, addressing to the contemporary philosophers, how these contemporary philosophers like John Searle, Daniel Dennett and Hilary Putnam, P. F. Strawson and many others have discussed this problem, whether philosophy really resolve the issues is a matter of debate again. we do discuss problems, we do debate on certain issues, but are these debate continuous? Yes, they are continuous. They are continuous because we need to look at the significance of the debate. We need to understand what is the significance of this debate. So, philosophical analysis, philosophical explanation do aspire for some kind of understanding. Philosophy does not explain away things like as it happened in the case of science. Science is mostly concerned with explanation, particularly causal explanations, and most of the philosophers of science who have been influenced by the scientific understanding of the reality of consciousness, they have tried to explain away the consciousness, the notion of consciousness from the reality. Now, so their whole approach is eliminative. Now, how science talks about this notion of consciousness, as I mentioned earlier, that philosophy as a discipline is not religious, philosophy as a discipline is not scientific, but philosophy has its unique position. Philosophy, as Wittgenstein once remarked, that philosophy is neither above science nor below the science. It is somewhere in the sense that it has its unique way of describing the reality. So, therefore, philosophical explanations are different. They are unique because they generate understanding. They are not a discipline which will be talking about dogmas or the disciplines which are nihilistic in approach. Philosophy is a rational enquiry, and philosophical approach has been critical, and so on and so forth. So, as a rational enquiry, we would try to locate the issues, we will try to study these issues of reductionism, dualism, emergentism, etc., and try to put them in a perspective. So, from that point of view, philosophy is a rational enquiry, and it is critical because we would examine these issues. We would examine, rather says, how Aristotle is talking about the concept of soul, and how Descartes is being refuting such an enterprise, and how Descartes is further refuted by the contemporary thinkers like Dennett and Searle. Our major thesis is centered around this, some of the important philosophers of mind, particularly John Searle, Daniel Dennett, Jerry Fodor, Michael Teichmann, and Paul Churchland, and many others. Now, when we discuss these philosophers, the main aim is to go back to the history of the problem. Now, where this problem arose before, and how these philosophers are addressing to the issues. Now, this is important because most of the time we find as if philosophers are only trying to repeat certain issues, but this repetition is certainly a philosophical enterprise. Other way of looking at it is that they do not just simply disagree. Now, disagreements is something very special to philosophy as a discipline, and philosophical enquiries need not have only one view. Philosophers do disagree, and that disagreement causes pluralism. The disagreements enlighten us in many ways, in the sense that when two philosophers disagree, they disagree on their approach to the problem. So, for example, Searle and Dennett disagrees with each other on this particular notion called consciousness or mind. Philosophers do disagree with each other. Now, their disagreement is based on their philosophical presuppositions. Say for instance, Searle disagrees with Descartes when Descartes says mind and body are two independent substances. Searle disagrees with that. Searle says they are not two independent substances, rather mind and body are causally connected with each other. Of course, Searle agrees to this idea that mind cannot be reducible to the brain processes, and when he says that, he also disagrees with his contemporary philosophers of mind. For instance, Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett would rather feel comfortable with this idea that mind is identical with the brain, and brain process is something central to the discourse of the mind. So, there is nothing called mind as such, rather what is there is only the brain processes. So, Dennett's position is quite different from the position that Searle will be taking. So, the contemporary debate would not only be a debate about the existing philosophical theories about the concept of mind, rather the contemporary debate is centered around how this problem can be traced from the history, and we will try to show how our philosophical inquiry we do make progress, not by explaining the facts as it is done in the case of science, but by initiating, bringing new facts and clarifying the concepts. So, clarity is the major issues here. The clarity is something that we would like to achieve when we talk about consciousness, because for many consciousness is a mystical entity, consciousness is a religious entity, but for a philosopher consciousness is not mystical, consciousness is not something which is not there. We are not nihilistic about consciousness. We do talk about consciousness, and we will be talking about what is the ontological significance of consciousness. So, in this perspective, our approach will be both contemporary, and will also look at how the contemporary philosophers are initiating their debate and bringing new ideas to us. That is our aim. When we say that philosophical knowledge or philosophical inquiry is a conceptual inquiry, we try to find out how certain concepts are difficult to understand, difficult to translate to ordinary languages. So, probably the lack of translation, the lack of analysis gives us this feeling that consciousness is something mystical. So, in that context, philosophy or philosophers bring new concepts into the discourse. So, that is something significant. So, concept displacement, as Professor Pradhan used to discuss, that concept displacement is something very significant to philosophical inquiry, as disagreement is something significant. Now, concept displacement is something significant. If Descartes is talking about substance dualism, then Searle is bringing that property dualism. So, people before Searle probably did not talk about property dualism, as it has been talked about in contemporary philosophy of mind. So, people only thought that yes, there is only one kind of dualism, that is called substance dualism, and consciousness does not have any property, or consciousness is not a property. So, concept displacement is a part of the discourse of philosophy of mind. Now, philosophy as a foundational discipline would definitely initiate this question, what is consciousness and how consciousness is related to human life. So, in this context we will be pointing out some of the issues which as I mentioned earlier that philosophy talks about the reality, and philosophical questions are fundamental questions. They are not general questions. Usually general questions are the questions which deals with facts. Now, philosophical questions are of course, they deal with facts, but here the nature of fact probably is something different. So, for example, when I say there are 50 students in my class, I am just stating a fact that there are 50 students in my class. So, I am just describing the fact, but when it comes to the philosophy, we are concerned with the questions which are very fundamental, like say for example, as I mentioned before, that what is justice, what is consciousness, what is life. These are fundamental questions, and philosophers are concerned with these questions. Now, when it comes to the philosophical debates, these questions are viewed from various perspectives, particularly the monists. So, for example, have tried to suggest a perspective where they think that only consciousness is real, only mind is real, but this could be also the other way. So, for example, a materialist monist, then I may say that the matter is only real and there is nothing called mind, and if at all there is something called mind, then that has to be explained by nature of the material principles. Now, matter is fundamental, and it is fundamental because it is ontologically real, and that constitutes the entire reality. So, the foundational principles on which the reality is constituted is matter. So, a materialist monist would certainly eliminate the notion of consciousness from the discourse of consciousness, but this elimination is something significant. It does tell us something very unique about consciousness, that is, consciousness is a byproduct of certain function of the material bodies that are existing in reality. When I suggest that consciousness is byproduct, what I mean is this, that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. Now, as an epiphenomenon, it does not have any ontological status. So, to have ontological status of consciousness, either we talk about the monist who accept that consciousness is real, and if I say both consciousness and matter, or mind and the matter both are real, then I am no more a monist, I am a dualist. So, dualists do accept that there are two fundamental principles which help us explaining the nature of reality. Now, so but dualists do have certain other philosophical problems. So, consciousness has to be, or the mind has to be viewed from different perspectives. So, they have to show us, I mean these philosophers would really enlighten us how these perspectives are important for achieving clarity. As I mentioned that clarity is an important thing in philosophical inquiry, and that has to be achieved because we do not want to just make a claim that consciousness is something mystical, consciousness is something spiritual. Just saying that it is mystical does not really make any sense to all of us, but since it is real, it has to be viewed how it is real, and therefore, we need to talk about different perspectives from which this particular concept is being viewed. This particular concept has been understood by these perspectives. So, from that point of view, consciousness is a rational study in the domain of philosophy. So, philosophers do talk about consciousness, and that talking is different from the scientific understanding of consciousness, but philosophers do share their understanding with the scientific understanding of consciousness. If you look at the present study in consciousness, most of the functionalist philosophers of mind do borrow their philosophical presuppositions from the achievement of science. So, it is not that there is no dialogue between philosophers and the scientists. It is not that philosophers study in their own way, and that is totally different from the way scientists look at the problem. So, it is not that way. So, philosophers do talk about the issues. They sometimes are enlightened by the scientific achievements, but philosophical progress is different from the scientific one. The progress in science is judged in terms of scientific productivity, scientific achievements, but philosophers' progress is judged from the point of view of clarity, from the point of view of lucidity, how clarity, one particular theory of mind, so biological naturalism, brings clarity about the nature of consciousness. So, that is, and how it refutes the substance dualism that has been debated in the history for centuries. So, that kind of clarity we consider as a progress in philosophy. So, this is one thing I think we need to talk about.